Andrew, so we'll make them all publicly available, as well as all the resources everyone's mentioned on the call today. Rodney, resilience is one of the least used terms in TCFD reporting. So in your professional opinion, as a former internal controller for a multinational organization, is there a specific internal control environment required for TCFD reporting? And if so, do most organizations currently possess it, or is this something new? And I know you've got some great things at WBCSD to address this.
I mean, this is one of the frustrations I have with the sustainability community in general, is that there's been this push and desire to produce information that goes out into the public domain without really much thought and attention as to where this information comes from, how reliable it is, how assurable it is, whether or not it's fit for purpose. And I know this because in my previous role before the WBCSD, I worked as a group director of risk management, internal control, and as part of my job, I was made responsible for sustainability reporting, and was somewhat horrified as a chartered accountant to find that it was all done in spreadsheets and approximations and assumptions and all the rest of it. What we're talking about with TCFD is a disclosure that relates to financial positioning, and therefore it needs to be as free from material misstatement as any other financial disclosures, as far as I'm concerned. And the sustainability community needs to realise that that working with finance on this is actually a synergistic activity and not something to be frightened of. If your internal controls don't exist or are broken, then you cannot rely on any information that is being produced. And I feel that one of the barriers to the peak TCFD, as you referred to, is that much more time and effort needs to be placed internally to ensure that the information that is being used to drive internal decision making and used to disclose to an external audience is much more rigorous and than it currently is today. If we're serious about materiality, then we need to have data that is that can be accounted for. And I know Martina was talking about the importance of comparability and comparability, and that you can rely upon this. In the absence of a control environment, well, you can't. So I feel that TCFD, like many other of the reporting frameworks that are out there, have failed in some respect to emphasize the importance of solid and strong control environment on which to make disclosures. You mentioned the word resilience, and I think that leads to another issue that we observe here at the WBCSD, is that many companies don't do risk management; they do risk reporting. So when we see the growth in risk reporting coming from vehicles such as the EU Transparency Directive in 2008, 2009, many companies created a process to be able to comply with that particular piece of legislation. And when it comes to risk management, what I've seen and actually heard risk managers say, our job is to get the risks ready for disclosure as opposed to actually managing them. And one of the big failures in enterprise risk management, I think, today is that we still are obsessed with predicting the future. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, is that we can't. Only 6 out of 150 companies that we did some desktop research on in April this year had any reference to a pandemic of this nature. When we look at the WEF report on risks that was published in January, a pandemic was mentioned in terms of impact, but was discounted as being unlikely to happen. But bear in mind, this is the 4th major respiratory illness in 18 years and the 2nd global pandemic in 11 years. So as human beings, we are not programmed to predict the future. We are obsessed, however, with believing we can. And that is the same issue when we look at risk management and in climate disclosure and climate risk management, is that we need to break away from our obsession with probability and look at our ability to manage recurring shocks that are much more frequent than we previously expected. This notion of climate change being a black swan or pandemic being a once in a lifetime thing. Well, it's actually happened in my lifetime and everybody else's lifetime in the last 11 years. It is not a black swan. If anything, it's probably a duck that looks a bit dirty. And there's a lot of them out there. And we need to realize that our job isn't to predict the future, but to manage it. And therefore, we need to see risk management evolve from asking the inane question of, is this likely to happen, to saying, if it did, could we manage it? Are we resilient? And if so, if not, how do we make that resilience within our organization real? So a long-winded way of saying that, we need internal controls. Finance needs to be heavily involved in TCFD disclosure practices. And when we look at the risk management, it does not surprise me that the Financial Stability Report's report last year showed risk management as one of the weakest areas of implementation. And I think it's weak because of our obsession with predicting the future. We need to get into assessing our own vulnerability to an uncertain future and to be honest about whether or not our business model and our flexibility, our ability to manage shocks is something that we can do.
Thanks, Rodney. And for anyone that hasn't had a look on the WBCSD website under Redefining Value pages, there's loads and loads of great resources there that Rodney has kind of indirectly kind of referred to there that can really help you think about your enterprise risk management, managing risk. Fantastic board games you can play internally to get some of these ideas going. Always really good fun. Rodney, just one last question for you. I'm sorry, we are running a little bit over, but the beauty of it being a live broadcast rather than a webinar is you can keep going, we can have some questions. So Rodney, you mentioned earlier the TCFD Preparer Forums, and you've been personally challenging me at CDSB to expand to cover social, so to go beyond environment to social, and your team have developed the Natural Capital Protocol. We know WBCSD are great for disruption. Should we be looking beyond climate with TCFD for all ESG issues and making it mandatory in mainstream filings by the end of 2021, in your opinion?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing in the TCFD that is not good business practice. I mean, it's about having good governance, it's about having scenarios, it's about having effective risk management, the important word there being management, and it's about metrics. There's nothing there that is revolutionary. What TCFD has brought to us is an institutional home like no other. So no disrespect to any of the reporting frameworks that exist today, but the fact that the TCFD was created and had a relationship with the Financial Stability Board and onward to the G20 finance ministers has given it an institutional home that makes it more credible than perhaps many of the other frameworks. But at the end of the day, what we need to address here is a balance between environmental, social, and governance, because we know that climate change, transition, and physical risks not only have issues in terms of the environment, but also on social. And what we've learned in the last few months is that a tiny, 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 tiny microscopic virus can bring companies to their knees. Many of those companies did not see that coming, and therefore are showing that perhaps risk management wasn't as effective as it could be. I always believe that we need to look at this holistically, and that we need to also make our accounting system future-proofed as well. It is in no one's interest that many of the big emitters become out of business, because our retirement assets in many cases are invested in them. We need a accounting system that allows companies to go into managed decline so that we can extract maximum value and not write off when we think something is impaired. So there's a lot that the system needs to rethink, because at the end of the day, this isn't about winners or losers, because all of humanity needs to be able to thrive as we transition to whatever the new normal is, whether that's the result of the pandemic or whether that's relating to what many believe will be a much bigger shock in the form of the climate emergency that we're facing. But if we haven't learned anything in the last 3 months, then I think that's a shame. The last 3 months has given us a taster of what the future has to hold. And the accounting profession, the investment community, the business community need to start talking to each other. They need to start coming up with solutions that create and preserve value, and that we work in partnership to create the society and the environment that we need.
Rodney,